So pleased, especially pleased to have today with us Dr. Teresa Kaczorowska, who took her flight from Warsaw to Chicago on the Polish Airlines slot on Wednesday and landed in Chicago in the middle of the blizzard with the expert and very courageous Polish pilots who brought Dr. Kaczorowska to us, and we are very, very pleased to have her today. Dr. Kaczorowska has a degree in humanities, journalism. She's a writer, poet, academic and lecturer at the Geisztor Academy of Humanities in Półtusk, Poland. Her research interest focuses on the Polish immigration to North and South America. Dr. Kaczorowska is also the author of the book Children of the Katyn Massacre. That book was first published in Polish and then it was translated into English, was in the United States, was published by the McFarland Company in 2004. This is a collection of interviews with the Katyn children, with the children of the Katyn victims. And so with that, I'm very pleased and delighted to have Dr. Kaczorowska from Poland with us today.
Welcome. Yes, I think the most difficult and the longest trip from Warsaw to Cleveland through snowstorm, through windows, etc. 3 days. I speak about my books about Katyn children. The problem of the Katyn crime has interested me from my youngest years. However, I made a decision to write a book about Katyn only 2000, when 3 mass burial sites at Katyn Forest, Miednoje, Russia, and in Kharkov, Ukraine, opened to the public as cemeteries. It was during the solemn ceremonies opening these necropolises that contain the remains of close to 15,000 out of 22,000 Polish victims that I decided to write about this tragedy. It was also during this time that I saw on television some of the children of the Katyn victims, sons and daughters of the Polish officer scattered around the world. I saw these people up close for the first time on Polish television. By the year 2000, they all were already in their twilight years. I observed they deeply felt pain, anguish, and distress, and I also witnessed their yearning for relief to bury their fathers with dignity and speak up what I fear about this odious crime that ruined their lives. It was then that I decided to contact some of the Katyn children in order to describe their struggles. The idea turned out to be more difficult than I could expect. It was not easy to find these people, to get to them in remote places in 6 different countries on 3 different continents. It was even more difficult to exalt them to their most painful memories. Despite all this, after several years of hard work, my book, factual documentary revealing a reality I know because forbidden for half a century, came into being. The book consists of 18 reports that described the fate of children of the Polish officers held in the Soviet the Katyn massacre. I also contact sons of two Polish officers who, although they taken prisoners, escaped the cruel fate of others and survived. But this luck didn't make their future any easier. Each of the 18 biographies is unique. All 18 of them were citizens of the Second Polish Republic at birth, but today live in 6 different countries. Several of them live in Poland, others live in Lithuania, Ukraine, the United States, Canada, and Israel. They all experienced traumatic hardships throughout their lives. So, Katyn's children from the earliest years were condemned to grave adversity as orphans wandering from the Soviet gulags and German prisons to the far corners of the world. Many of them in permanent exile from their homeland. Among these children are the deportees to the depths of the Soviet Union, those imprisoned in death camps and slave labor camps, whether in German territory and in that of the Soviet Union. Among them are members of the resistance, the Grey Rank Youth Resistance, the Union and Armed Struggle, the Home Army, and participants of the 1944 National Uprising in Warsaw. Today they are people of various professions. They are like ordinary people, like the rest of us, but in their hearts they carry a horrific baggage of history. They all carry the scar of Katyn. The very scar of Katyn made it extremely difficult. In particular, gaining education and making careers was an uphill battle for the Katyn children, and the Soviet made clandestine dissuasive efforts to hold them back. The children quickly learned that they couldn't even mention their fathers' names for fear of being discriminated against. This experience of being persecuted for just mentioning for their fathers' names forced the Katyn children to live with a lie in great uncertainty and ever-present fear. My book attempts to present to children suffering not only as a result of their father's mysterious disappearance, but also because they were deprived of using their father's surnames, lacked any knowledge of their resting place, and had no access to their graves. They were sometimes told that the graves of the alleged criminals weren't to be honored. The book also shows how the children survive while living with stigma of the lie. One, the characters of my book, Wesley Adamczyk from Chicago, the son of the Polish officer from Wołyń, presently the Ukraine, who lost his father in the Katyn massacre, found relief only in the year 2000, when for the first time he visited the Katyn forest and prayed at his father's grave. He then described his life in biography, When God Looked at the Other Way. Wesley Adamczyk is here. Welcome. Another child, Alicja Patej-Grabowska, a philologist and poet who lives in Warsaw, shares her experience about growing up in Poland as a child, the Katyn officer. Her father, Kazimierz Roman Grabowski, was an established educator and psychologist. When Poland was attacked by the Nazi Germany on September the 1st, 1998, he was summoned to defend his homeland. Days later, when Poland was attacked by her other neighbor, the Soviet Union, he was taken prison and was executed by NKVD in Katyn by a single shot to the back of his head. He was 59 years old and his daughter Alicia not even 3. In my book Children of the Katyn Massacre, Alicia records her Katyn scar as follows. She thought, these experiences and repressions were the cause of Mom's constant fear. She ceased speaking out loud about her husband's Katyn past. She understood that the word Katyn was a stigma, that is awake panic, and that it meant cancellation of opportunity in the lives of her children. My mother and I had to swear, my brother and I had to swear to her that we too would keep our silence and not ever bring up any mention of Katyn. Mom placed a tape not only over her months, but over the months of my brother and me as well. From the time forward, we lived not only in sorrow for our murdered father, but also in the consciousness of a lie, with the feeling of being wrong, with shame and humiliation, and with questions. For what? Why? Mom didn't live to see the time when it was possible to speak openly and loud about Katyn without any tape over the month. She worked long and hard. She taught my son as well. She never remarried, and she loved my father her entire life. She died in 1983. I wish to stress something extremely important. The Polish prisoners of war weren't executed because of any committed crimes and trial actions. They were murdered because of their nationality, in accordance with a wider plan of exterminating the Polish state. This became the primary goal of the Soviet leaders once they signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact on August the 23rd, 1939. Whether the Polish elite wanting to wage a war of independence in the future, Stalin decided to eliminate about 22,000 of Polish intelligentsia and expel their families from the Polish lands. The Soviet government blamed Germans for the Katyn massacre and protected this lie for half a century. The aggressive propaganda and political actions were also aimed at erasing any material traces and immaterial memories of the Katyn crime. The Soviets were preoccupied with the destruction of evidence of the Katyn crime to very last days of the Soviet Empire. Here is an excerpt from my book on how the excavations of mass graves after the collapse of the Soviet Union revealed that the bones of the victims in mass graves were grinded in effort to destroy the incriminating evidence. It comes from a testimony of Ewa Gruner, a doctor from Szczecin, from Poland, who lost her father, Julian Gruner, a well-known doctor from Lviv, now in the Ukraine, in the Katyn massacre. He was shot dead by an NKVD in the cellars in Kharkov and buried in the nearby KGB forest. He was 42 years old, and his only daughter, Eva, was just 6. As a medical doctor, Eva took part in the exhumation in Kharkov. She recalls her experience as follows. I was recruited for the exhumation at Kharkov for 2 sessions, 1994 and 1996, altogether for 8 weeks. Together with my team, I was to examine the 4 quadrants of the forest park. It was there that the burial place of the murdered prisoners of war from Starobielsk had come to light. It was also the team's doctor. I boarded a bus full of laughing, boisterous young people. The students from Nicholas Copernicus University in Toruń, from Poland, were going on an archaeological practicum. I, however, was going to my father's funeral. We went to the site of exhumation. Traces of earlier excavations were evident in the bones protruding from the ground. Here a jaw, there a segment of skull, elsewhere a tibia. I was fearful that I was walking over remains, perhaps over my father's bones. I walked tiptoe. The feeling of the profanation of this place was deepened by the sight of scattered bottles and trash, as well as traces of campfires and recreational footpaths. After all, this had been a rest area for a KGB. I wanted to cross out all these faults with hard work. I worked as a machine. I dug, I extracted from the earth each last remains. I checked over the already examined heaps, lest there remain in them yet some particle. Work conditions were incredibly difficult. It's hard enough to imagine, let alone to describe. In the deep excavations, often filled with cadaverous fluid which splashed on us, pieces and bodies would tumble down. In the largest of these graves, corpses were preserved in their entirety, with hands, legs, toes, faces. They lay in disorder, as if from vehicles. Some their hands tied behind their backs by a rope having two characteristic knots, or barbed wire. We found complete bodies, but only where the large drills, the so-called meat grinders, hadn't passed over. For in the years from 1970 to 1980, here in this cemetery, as it seems in other cemeteries in the Soviet Union, gigantic industrial machines destroyed the traces of Soviet crimes. In some graves in Kharkov, 60 to 70% of the skulls had been crushed. Traces of these meat-greetings machines exist to this day. In one of the halls of death, we uncovered also a corpse crushed by a huge stone. In another, the partishly burned. Dear listeners, the quoted excerpts come from the first edition of my book entitled When You Are Here, It Hurts Less. This book was published in Poland in 2003. This book was also published in English as a Children of the Katyn Massacre in 2016 in the USA. Next year, on the 70th anniversary of the Katyn Massacre, the second edition of this book was released in Poland entire Dzieci Katynia. It is this book. It was published in Warsaw by Bellona in 2010. This edition is supplement with additional material as new facts were released in the last years. In 2004, Russia discontinued a 14-year-long Katyn investigation, virtually closing its archives on Katyn. Even the grounds for terminating the investigation were categorized as top secret and not released to the public. Subsequently, an independent Polish investigation was launched by the Institute of National Remembrance, IPN, and the Commission for the Prosecution of Crimes Against the Polish Nation. But its progress has been severely impeded by Moscow's lack of cooperation. Nevertheless, the situation didn't discourage the Polish prosecutors, and the Polish investigation continues. In 2007 year, 13 of the Katyn children turned to the European Court of Human Rights for help. Thus, the new edition of my book includes 2 new chapters about 2 children who sued the Russian government before the European Tribunal for Human Rights. The investigation in Strasbourg is ongoing, but Russia still doesn't feel any responsibility for the crime, and in the explanatory notes sent to Strasbourg, the Katyn massacre was named as the Katyn events. Another excerpt from this new edition of my book deals with the struggle of the Katyn children to seek justice. This excerpt concerns Krystyna Krzyszkowiak, a teacher from Warsaw, whose father, Michał Adamczyk, was the police officer in pre-war Poland. In autumn of 1939, after Germany invaded Poland on September the 1st, and the Soviet Union did the same on September the 17th, Krystyna's father was taken prisoner by the Soviets and placed in the Ostashków camp. In the spring of 1940, he was transported to Ostashków, from Ostashków to Kalinin, where he was executed with a shot to the back of the head in the NKVD cellars, and subsequently buried in the ditch in the Miednoje forest. He was 37 years old, and his daughter Krystyna was about to be born. She told. In the summer of 1940, 91, on August the 31st, Krystyna Krzyżkowiak visited Miednoje to the place of her father's burial for the first time. She saw a humid forest with dark-colored soil, the color of the navy blue police uniforms. Its color hadn't been altered by the fees brought there from the NKVD summer cottages. She trod on the dark but smelling ground, on human remains, searching for her father's steps, breath, and energy. She fastened white and red ribbons, his photo, and flowers on birch crosses. After the exhumation was over, all this was placed in the ditches, in the holes made in sounding drills. She and others lit candles brought from Poland, which all together form a lit cross. She asked herself about her unhappy childhood, about his execution without trial, blame, and rehabilitation. She wondered whether her father doesn't deserve a grave in the motherland instead of the common one in the ditch on the cursed by the officer in 1940 land, the oppressor's land. Krystyna Krzyżkowiak and her complainants are represented in Strasbourg by well-known Polish lawyers specializing in international law. They are extremely involved in the case and don't take any fees for their work. They all admit that Russia should take an opportunity and admit their involvement in the murder, which is worth no anyway. Moscow should also release information of the discontinued case and open its archives. It is important not only for the Polish-Russian relationships, but for the international community as well. There is no crime without the perpetrators. Dear listeners, I would like to help spread the truth about the Katyn massacre on the which judgment hasn't been passed till these days. It has neither been condemned by Russia nor any international court or body. I dream of a day when my country, Poland, will arise once and forever the foundation of the Katyn lie. We should start building our future based on principles for which our fathers and grandfathers gave their lives, both in the spring of 1940 and on April the 10th, 2010, in the same forest. Thank you very much.